There's been a change in session at Charbagh at 11, which I want you guys to know about. So basically, earlier it was the drama of ideas, how theatre and philosophy have always been intertwined. That session, which was to happen at 11, has been changed, and now the session that will be at 11 after this is the right to dissent. Jawahar Sirkar and Priyanka Chaturvedi in conversation with Tripur Daman Singh. So please note this change, in those sheets what you're holding, ma'am, that colorful sheet, that's not been updated there, it's updated on the website. So please keep that in mind. Okay, let's start the first session of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, namaskar and adab. Welcome to the 16th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banika Swasth India, the Bank of Baroda Charbagh stage. We are delighted to introduce Accidental Gods, Men Unwittingly Turned Divine. This session is presented by the Embassy of Ireland. Writer, critic and scholar Anna Della Subin's latest work, Accidental Gods on Men Unwittingly Turned Divine, is a provocative history of race, empire and myth, told through the stories of men who have been worshipped as gods. In conversation with art historian and curator Katy Hessel, Subin traces the colonial desire for divinity, its links to race, and questions the relationship between tyranny, violence, and godliness. We invite both of you on stage. A short introduction about both of them, and then it'll be over to you, Katy. Anna Della Subin is a writer, critic, and scholar born in New York. Her essays have appeared in the New York Review of Books, Harper's, the New York Times, among others. Accidental Gods is her first book. Katy Hessel is an art historian, broadcaster, and curator dedicated to celebrating women artists from all over the world. She is the founder of an Instagram account which is called @TheGreatWomenArtists. I'll repeat that if anybody wants to follow her, @TheGreatWomenArtists, which has about 3 lakh followers. Katy, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you all so much for coming. It's so wonderful to see you here, and Anna Della for being in conversation on your fantastic book, Accidental Gods, Men Unwittingly Turned Divine. This book is just rich. It's full of life, stories. It talks about empire, race, religion, myth. In a way, because it focuses on the gods, it actually almost leaves so much room for actually how we've been shaped by society. And actually the absence sort of speaks louder than that. It taught me so much and just so many stories that I can't wait to go into depth with you today. So this book, as you write in the introduction, does not seek to determine whether people believed in unwitting gods, but instead let us ask why these stories exist, why they have been constructed and retold, and how they have shaped our world. So I'd love to start off to ask you about the definition of accidental gods and this term that you use, apotheosis. Could you expand on that and tell us what is at the crux of this book?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Katy. I'm thrilled you enjoyed the book, and just wanted to thank the directors of the festival. I've just been having the most fantastic time over the past few days, and I can't believe that we're at the last day. And I also wanted to thank the Embassy of Ireland for sponsoring this event. Who is the accidental god? An accidental god is someone who has had divinity thrust upon him. He's not like the zealous founder of a cult who becomes deified. And he's not quite a saint, someone who's within a religious community who then becomes singled out for kind of remarkable piety or miracles. This is someone who, through forces of accident, chance, and coincidence, finds themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time and is taken or mistaken for a god. And once you start looking for this figure, you find them everywhere. So I guess I should talk a little bit more about what I mean about a god. Like, what does it mean to be turned unwittingly divine? And in my book, Divinity is a spectrum. It's not a binary of God and man, especially in a kind of Judeo-Christian sense where there's God the Almighty at a distance in heaven far from us, and humans are on earth, and there's this chasm that can never be crossed. In this book, divinity encompasses an entire range of what the late anthropologist Marshall Solins has called meta-persons. So this is, demigods, ancestor deities, avatars, Islamic jinn, spirits who can possess people's bodies when they're in the state of the trance. So it's a huge array of ways of thinking about the sacred.
And when was it that you became interested in this subject?
Well, I worked on this book for 10 years, but I had studied the ancient world as a student. I studied classics, and I was really steeped in kind of Greco-Roman ideas of the apotheosis of emperors. Apotheosis meaning literally the making or becoming of a god. So I had, studied all of these histories of Roman emperors turned into gods. And then I studied Sanskrit in graduate school, and I was really interested, especially in Indian philosophies of illusion and ideas of the avatar. And then at Harvard Divinity School, I studied early Christian notions of Christ's deification. So this was all like inside my head. But then when I graduated, I took a job at this Middle Eastern culture magazine, and the revolutions of the Arab Spring broke out in 2011, and we picked up our office and we moved to Tahrir Square in Cairo, right? Kind of the epicenter of the protests. And so suddenly, here I was, this person who had been very monastically steeped in the ancient world, suddenly colliding with the modern present. And I found myself at this moment of just pure political ecstasy when Mubarak had just stepped down and the future looked limitless. So I was thinking a lot about how do political ideas catch fire? What drives people to risk their lives and go out and protest, for politics? And it just seemed to me that, you couldn't understand it without ideas that were somehow religious in nature, This was, in many ways, people saw it as a secular moment, but there was something driving it that just seemed beyond the secular. And I started thinking a lot about the power of charismatic autocrats. And at one point, I just had this weird revelation, what happens if a politician has too much charisma? He might find himself turned into a god, like Haile Selassie among the Rastafari, which we'll talk a bit about later. And so I kind of became obsessed with this idea of how an emperor on one side of the earth in Ethiopia could become God on the other side in Jamaica without even knowing it or even being informed that he'd been turned into a god. So I became obsessed with this idea, and then the idea, it really just took off from there.
But I think it's so interesting, the way that we position people in political power or people in religious power. I mean, there is so much that corresponds with religion and secularism as well. But also, I'm fascinated to know also, how does looking at these accidental gods actually help us understand the world in which we live? So what does it say about our society if we are deifying these secular people?
Yeah, absolutely. As I was kind of on this quest for accidental gods, I found that I just needed a word to to capture what I was after. And the word I use in the book is mytho-politics. And that's not a word that's in the dictionary yet, although I've noticed people are kind of starting to use it more and more. But it's a way to capture how politics is kind of deeply driven by mythological thinking. And by myth, I mean a kind of story that is also a theory of how the world came to be as we know it, what the future holds, what's the next right step to take. Myths are kind of calls to action. They summon us to do the work of transformation. And they transcend true and false. And so they're so powerful. And so all these stories in my book kind of constitute a modern mythology in a way. And I'm using them to really get at the relationship between politics and divinity, between empire and race and patriarchy. And so it for me, it's just been a kind of, an eccentric but powerful lens into how the modern world came to be as it is.
Totally. I think when I was reading it, whether we look at Haile Selassie or whether we look at Baden Powell, actually how much these figures, from 100 years ago actually still shape so much of our world today. But obviously you mentioned the patriarchy, and I'd love to also start off with sort of discussing women, because in a way there is this kind of echoing absence of women in the book as well. I mean, you write, and also what is a female god? Is it a goddess? And what does that term mean? I mean, you write, we call the female deity a goddess, as if something less than a god, and there are few of them here, an absence taken on the heart of this book, which examines how a military general worshipped as a god became an icon of modern masculinity and a role model for how man should be. I mean, what role do women play? I mean, how do you see the word goddess in this context?
Yeah, I knew you would notice the incredibly conspicuous lack of women in my book. It's kind of the story of gods without women. But I didn't set out to write a book entirely about men. I really thought I was going to find more female characters, I'd read Ian Forster's novel, A Passage to India, and I thought I was going to find more characters like Mrs. Moore, who's the kind of wizened older mother who's worshipped as a god after her death because she alone properly recognizes the injustice of the Malabar caves. And I thought I'd find kind of more real-life figures like this, but I couldn't find her. I found a number of stories of deified colonial wives, British colonial wives, or the Empress Menen, Haile Selassie's wife, is deified in the religion of Rastafari. But in my book I have an index in the back of inadvertent deities, and there are about 90 figures in my book, and only 10 of them are women. And I think the reasons for this are twofold. On the one hand, you have to look at, who's writing down these narratives. And for the most part, it's kind of white Christian imperialist colonizers and the scribes of empire who are writing down these accounts of apotheosis. And these are writers who are coming out of a tradition in which God is male. He's God the Father, the Almighty, and he's male, and he's also seen as white. And so women aren't getting mistaken for gods because they simply don't look like God, and the stories they write, the few stories they write down take on a kind of like tragicomic aspect, of like, oh, how ridiculous it is for a woman to be mistaken for God. So that's one part of it. But then I'm also looking at how these stories of apotheosis have actually seeped into our modern construction of masculinity itself. So one figure in particular is the Brigadier General John Nicholson. And William Dalrymple has actually called him, quite rightly, the great imperial psychopath. He's actually probably the most violent god in my book, and he's, the great, either you call him the hero or the villain of the Indian uprising of 1857. And the story goes that a religion coalesced around him of several hundred sepoys, and then it grew to encompass all these different groups of people. And, in a way, worshiping Nicholson, who was so violent that he kept a severed head on his desk, although not for literary inspiration, just to strike terror into the hearts of everyone. Worshipping him became a way to kind of appropriate his power. But on the other hand, the British historians and writers and, BBC producers have kind of told and retold this story. And one of the most kind of influential retellings of Nicholson's godhood was in the Boy Scouts manual by Lord Baden-Powell, where Nicholson kind of becomes an idol or a role model for young boys to aspire to. It's kind of like, well, how should a man be in the world? Well, they should act like someone who would get mistaken for a god. And then Nicholson keeps reappearing in the stories of Kipling, and he appears in Samuel Smiles' text, Self-Help. And so he really becomes a kind of icon of modern masculinity, and that's the man mistaken for God. So this space of divinity kind of becomes ever more male, as it were.
Yeah, you use the term muscular Christianity in the book, which was the first time I'd actually heard this term. And actually, when we also think about representations of God and Christ in art history as well, it is this kind of white, heroic man sort of imbued in this kind of long lineage of classical heroicism as well.
Yes, exactly. It seeks its aesthetic inspiration from literally the bodies of the kind of demigods of ancient Greece. So figures like Antinous, who is deified by the Emperor Hadrian. It kind of creates this, this visual of modern masculinity that can be mistaken for godhood. And it's, it today continues to be a profoundly influential ideal.
Yeah, but just to go back to the women as well, I mean, just the fact that actually what can we learn from the absence of women as gods? It's also a kind of reflection on us as a society. Do we deify women as gods? I think we have to kind of question ourselves with that as well. But I mean, you mention these extraordinary figures such as Annie Besant and Madame Blavatsky, yet someone like Annie Besant never actually becomes a goddess. I mean, can you tell us their stories and why you wanted to interweave them into this book?
Yeah, absolutely. So Annie Besant is really forgotten in most of the world today, especially in the UK. She's an English woman of Irish descent as well. But it's really in India that her memory has been best preserved, and her very kind of deeply ambivalent legacy. She's famous for being a union activist, socialist, women's rights campaigner. She was the first woman to make a public statement about contraception. And then when she was asked to review a book by Madame Blavatsky, who's the kind of infamous mystic who founded theosophy, which is a movement that sees all religions as being pathways to the same truth, which began in the mid-19th century. And so Annie Besant was asked to review this book by Blavatsky, and she was completely converted by it, which I find to be a kind of funny idea, since I review books myself all the time, and you don't know if it might just convert you and change your life. But so Annie had begun her career really as a housewife married to a vicar in the Church of England. And she soon realized that she was an atheist and she would have to leave the marriage. And this led to a terrible custody battle in which she lost custody of her 2 children. But when she became a theosophist, she moved to India, to the theosophical compound in Adyar and Madras. And theosophy was looking for the arrival of the Messiah, or the Maitreya. And this is, of course, the figure who's come in the form of Jesus and the Buddha and Krishna, and some say Muhammad. And they're all waiting for this figure. And then they famously locate the next vessel for the Messiah in a boy, Jiddu Krishnamurti, and they see him bathing on the beach. And then you have this kind of stunning paradox that Annie Besant, who had lost her own children, then essentially kidnaps Krishnamurti from his father, along with Krishnamurti's brother, and then she raises him as a baby god and keeps him kind of held captive in the Theosophical Society. And so in my book, I talk a bit about, like, how do you groom somebody to become a god? What's the daily schedule like? And they're reading him like ghost stories at night to make sure that to eradicate any sense of fear, because a god can't know any kind of sense of fear. But then a second custody battle ensues, in which Krishnamurti's father tries to seek back his sons. And this really becomes a kind of proxy for questions of India's liberation. So the custody trial is in 1913, and to the side of Krishnamurti's father rallies a growing Hindu network of activists who are seeking India's total liberation from the British. And then on the other side, you have Annie Besant, who fights for India's home rule, but she still wants India to be a part of the Commonwealth, and she still sees the British Empire as playing a sort of mother role akin to her own. So it's deeply, thorny story. And then at some point, Krishnamurti's father says that he had thought of Annie Besant herself as divine. So she also is imbued in with divinity in a way.
It's also so fascinating how, people are groomed to become gods. And then sometimes, I guess, in the sense with royalty, they're born into it. And in a way, from birth, these people who have been born for, a day or so, they're already seen as other and higher than us. And they have this sort of higher power because they're blue-blooded or something. I mean, it's still the case very much today when we look at the royal family. I mean, you mentioned Queen Victoria, as a woman, she really didn't accept herself as a god. I mean, tell us a bit more about the acceptance of people accepting the fact that they are gods.
Right, yeah, so Queen Victoria is one of the few women in the book where there actually is a kind of brief religion that coalesces around her, allegedly. So in the late 19th century, reports began circulating of a movement in Orissa that was worshipping Queen Victoria as God. And the reasons why they were doing that was because her head was on the rupee. And, coins have always had portraits of the gods on them from the very beginning, even our English word money comes from an epithet of the goddess Juno, moneta, kind of the protector of the value. So, in many ways it made perfect sense to worship Queen Victoria as a god, because there she was on the currency. But, the British press really seized upon this story because it seemed to sanctify their imperialist presence in India. And so, that the stories were reported, but it's unclear whether Queen Victoria actually ever heard about it herself. But what's really paradoxical is that Victoria didn't believe in political power for women herself, even though she was like a god. She actively sabotaged women's rights campaigners. She wrote that she thought they should be whipped. So she was really, a god in spite of herself in more ways than one.
But then there was, on the other hand, in 1977, Prince Philip, who was famously married to, who was married to the Queen, he actually knew about the religious sort of group who worshipped him.
Yes, so to tell you a bit about that story, so in 1973, Prince Philip was vacationing on the royal yacht Britannia with the Queen. off the coast of the island of Tanna in Vanuatu. And a few chiefs saw him standing on deck of the yacht in his white naval uniform, looking resplendent. And they just knew that he was the son of the volcano god Kalbaban. And this was a deity who had been born in Tanna, resided in the volcano, and then had left Tanna to go out and work for the betterment of the islands in the world. And it was said that he would one day return, bringing with him prosperity and an end to all sickness and death itself. And so beginning in the mid-1970s, a religion began to form around Prince Philip, and soon he did learn about it, and he struck up this really interesting relationship with his worshippers, where, for instance, they sent him a ritual pig-killing stick, and then he posed with it on the lawn of Buckingham Palace and sent it back, and the palace was kind of constantly seeding new rituals and new myths on the island. So the religion that exists into the present day, even in the wake of Philip's transitioning to the higher plane, it's really a work of kind of mutual myth making between the island of Tanna and the British. And the Tannese worshippers of Philip have a really interesting cosmology where they see Britain and Tanna as once having been connected islands that were broken apart by continental drift. But there's this deep kind of connection. They see that each person has both a black and a white individual residing within them, and you have a kind of counterpart or a divine double who lives on the other side of the earth, and you can tap into their power in a supernatural way. And so here you have a people, in a part of the world that is often written off as marginal or as not participating in the kind of bigger global order. And this is a really powerful, theological way of seeking connection, kind of building threads between Tanna and the UK. And and to me, what I'm really interested in is how the divine right of kings continues to exist among us. So today, it's still in the background. And I think it's in the background of class, for instance. I think it still kind of structures, our hierarchies. Who do we see as being more than human? Who's less than human? I think it still persists in a really sinister way. And what I'm trying to do in the book is just, pose the question of the British press has really made a huge mockery of the Prince Philip religion, and it's often branded a cargo cult, which is a pejorative term that was invented during World War II to kind of slander native resistance movements as being fanatical. And so it tends to be called a cargo cult, but actually, what I'm asking is it really more irrational to believe that Prince Philip is a god than to believe that the British monarchy should still exist, to me, it's truly the British Empire and the American Empire who are really the biggest cargo cults of them all. They spread the doctrine of capitalism across the earth. And especially with the British monarchy, you still see it in the kind of merchandise that, the cargo that comes along with the British monarchy at every occasion. So I'm just kind of, I'm just trying to have us think more deeply about what drives these movements, such as the Philip worshippers, and it's actually a really interesting, sophisticated body of thought behind them.
Absolutely, and I think what I found so fascinating as well is the fact that, we really span so much time in the book, and really thinking about actually the history of gods, or our perception of historical gods. And actually sometimes after someone dies, or they perhaps, a bit like in the Prince Philip where he lives in such an other world, it's easy to deify them, because in a way sometimes after someone's gone we can sort of sometimes forget some of the wrongdoings that they convicted or what happened in their lives. And I think that's also interesting, how have gods changed over time. So you use the very famous story of Haile Selassie, who's the head of Rastafarianism, and actually this guy wasn't necessarily a clean slate during his life, yet there are cultures and religions all over the world who worship him, who not necessarily know. I mean, I'm just using him as an example. There are so many, again, like the British monarchy as well. I mean, can we use the Haile Selassie case as a particular example? And should we still worship people who have been convicted of crimes in their life?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think your question really gets at the problem of evil itself. But to tell the story of Haile Selassie's apotheosis a little, to situate us. So in 1930, Haile Selassie crowned himself Emperor of Ethiopia in this spectacular coronation ceremony in Addis Ababa. And he invited all of the powers of the earth to attend, because he was deep in the struggle for succession with another princely nobleman, and he needed to create a kind of veneer of legitimacy on the international stage. And so, journalists from across the world were there. Evelyn Waugh was reporting on the coronation for the Times and described it as this totally unrehearsed mess, and the crown was stashed in a cardboard box. But the American Consul General was there covering it for National Geographic. And he wrote about the event in these kind of rapturous biblical tones. And there was one line in particular in the National Geographic story which seemed to suggest that King George V's own son, the Duke of Gloucester, had gotten down on bended knee before Haile Selassie and paid homage. And so on the other side of the world, in Jamaica, people heard the news of the coronation over the radio, and then they saw the National Geographic article, and several people had the same idea completely independently and spontaneously, that God was alive on earth right now, and he was a black man. And this idea was incredibly powerful on an island that was still under British colonial rule, where people were living amid terrible oppression and hardship and poverty. And so this idea very quickly caught fire on the island. But it was, especially that line about the Duke of Gloucester bowing down. But it was deeply paradoxical, because on the one hand, Haile Selassie himself didn't consider himself black. He identified as Semitic. And the religion would be called Rastafari, which is a reference to his earlier title, which is Ras, a title kind of like Duke, and Tafari, his birth name, Tafari Makonnen. But when he became emperor, he took on the baptismal name of Haile Selassie, and he would fine anybody who called him Rastafari. It was kind of seen as derogatory. But nevertheless, as I write in the book, gods are able to withstand their own contradictions. This is one mark of divinity. So the Rastafari religion grew to about 1 million followers today. But what you're asking is so Haile Selassie, we remember him as this terrible dictator, and he's a figure who in the 1970s turned a blind eye to the terrible famine in Ethiopia, and that led to him being deposed in a coup. And how do his worshippers come to terms with this? How do you worship a living God who's letting his own people starve to death? And it brings us right up to the problem of evil that pervades all religious traditions in a way. Why does God permit suffering? Why does the biblical God allow Job to suffer? And it's very much unresolved. Rastafari thinkers are also grappling with the legacy of slavery. Why did Haile Selassie permit the kidnapping and enslaving of peoples from West Africa? And it's not solved, but I think it's that kind of, this is what sustains religion's thoughts, these kind of problems that you can never quite get at. We'll never solve them.
I'd love to come to questions in a second, because we haven't got much time left, but I'd also just love to bring it to the present day as well, and actually, who are the gods of our present day? And also this idea of human gods and human flaws. I mean, where do we stand on that? And how much do we forgive? Because, you use the example of Trump, for example, in your book.
Yeah, Trump is very much present in my book, and I think more and more we're going to see the deification of autocrats and politicians. I think the world around us is just becoming ever more apocalyptic, especially in the face of climate change. It's becoming more biblical, whether it's, fires, floods, plague, and we really, we're up against such problems that we really need a Messiah.
Yeah.
So we're just gonna, be looking for these figures more and more.
It is so interesting, actually, that we need a leader to cling on to, sort of no matter what they do in the world.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, particularly today, right-wing movements have kind of seized upon this nexus between divinity and power in a way that's, much more instrumentalizing and driving than left-wing movements, I think kind of what I'm trying to suggest in my book is that we can create new gods all the time. We're the ones who are writing these myths, and the sacred is this kind of space that's forever open. It's up for grabs to any political project, and it's a profoundly driving force for causes of liberation and causes of oppression. And so I think, the left would do well to kind of try and seize upon it too,
But also just the idea of gods almost being a very sort of hierarchical capitalist structure as well, with this one person being at the top. In a way, we almost have to sort of reframe what we mean by gods, and making sure that, someone is not actually more powerful than others in so many different ways.
Yes, exactly. Going back to Haile Selassie, it's really interesting how, this worship of an autocrat actually became a profoundly democratizing force in Jamaica, because you have Jamaican politicians such as Michael Manley, who then seize upon Rastafari ideas to steer the country in the direction of democratic socialism. And so, these figures can kind of lead us towards democracy in a way that is, deeply unexpected.
Absolutely. I'd love to take some questions from the audience. The man in the navy jacket.
Thank you. How far is Christianity open to, Christianity with its Trinity, belief in the Holy Trinity, open to the belief in polytheism? The second part of the question is, would you believe that polytheism in the erstwhile colonies was a decolonization strategy?
That's really interesting. I think, so many thinkers have kind of looked at Christianity and the doctrine of the Trinity and seen polytheism, and a lot of people don't want to hear that. But it's very, that's a really kind of sharp comment. But no, definitely, in my book, so I'm looking at both how these narratives of apotheosis were used, especially by British colonizers, to sanctify their civilizing mission. Like in a place like India, they were really like using these stories to kind of paint a portrait of like a spiritual, irrational East that was in need of their influence in a way. And this narrative then, gets taken back in Indian liberation movement. So you have, in my book, I write about the deification of figures such as Gandhi, of course, in the 1920s, especially on his campaigns in Gorakhpur, where he's hailed as an avatar of Vishnu, and stories are circulating of his miracles, and this becomes a kind of profoundly, ultimately inflaming force. And I'm also looking at a little-known sect in 1959 that worships Nehru as a god, just at the moment when he's enshrined religious freedom into the Indian Constitution, he then finds himself worshipped as a god, and he allegedly hates it. He's appalled, but there's nothing he can do about it because, freedom of worship has become, the law. So I very much kind of take it up through decolonization right up to the present day.
And the man on the front? Oh, yeah.
Thanks for a great session. This is very interesting. So, my question is that you spoke about some of the current gods and recent gods. There are people, and there are people in my family who believe in certain deities, who are people at that present time, 300-400 years back, who really helped people, and they were considered gods. But what makes it go through the centuries and still the legend continues to affect people and they continue to celebrate it? So, for example, President Trump might become that deity for, let's say, 20 years, 30 years, and the people might start not liking him. But there are figures in history where people continue to praise these people for centuries. What do you think affects that kind of a behavior? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in my book, I have a kind of range of gods. Like some of them are very briefly short-lived. It's almost like devotions kind of misfire and they're worshipped for, maybe it's even a week. But then other gods have like real deep staying power, whether it's Haile Selassie, but the earliest stories in my book I'm kind of looking at, we haven't gotten a chance to talk about it really, but I'm looking at the kind of myths of European explorers who are hailed as gods among the peoples of the New Worlds. And I'm looking, I'm not looking so much at what sustains belief, but what sustains the writings of these stories. Like, why are these stories constantly told and retold for centuries, for 500 years? Like, what does it teach us about the world that we're living in? And in a way, in my book, I'm kind of trying to not ask, like, do people really believe in these accidental gods or not? Because I myself feel very uncomfortable with making claims about what people really believed or what they didn't. I think you can never truly know what another person believes. So in my book, I try to avoid ever even writing the sentence like, these people believe this or these people believe that. I only say, like, they said this, or the idea circulated, or they knew this to be true. So that's just kind of been a deep principle for me.
We've got hardly any time left. Yes, the girl with the scarf, thanks.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for such insightful session. So my question is that, as you made the statement that we can create gods all the time, it was a very optimistic statement and I believe in it too. But my question is that one of the major bone of contention between far right and far left is the concept of believing. So far left is often associated with atheism and far right, as you said. So when we say that we can create new gods and we can discard the ones like conservative ideology, so where will it fit in the political spectrum. So how do we basically navigate the liberal side and conservative side with this ideology of optimism? Thank you.
That's an amazing question. You know, I think I probably don't have an answer for it, but you know, I'm trying to call our attention to the power of myths, you know, the power of these stories, and how they're always around us at every moment. And I think, you know, I mean, I guess like the left movements like have like, you know, such greater degrees of kind of public infighting, and like, you know, they're just like, because of, like you say, like, they don't rally around messiah figures as effectively as the right. And I'm kind of just trying to tease out in my book how, like, actually, I mean, it's counterintuitive, but deification has been a powerful form of resistance and liberation. And, you know, maybe we can take something away from it, or even just be kind of a bit more attuned to the, like, sort of texture of transcendence that exists in our politics at every moment, and how we harness that, you know.
Wonderful. I'm sorry, we're out of time, but thank you all so much for coming. Anna Della Subin, thank you so much. She'll be signing books and will be around for more. Thank you all for coming.
Hi, thank you Katy Hessel and Anna Della Subin for this discussion, and the audience for your questions, and again for being here on a Monday morning for the first session on our last day. As a token of our appreciation, please accept these cards from us. We'd like to thank the Embassy of Ireland for their support for this session, and I'd also like to thank our sponsors. I'll quickly go through the list. ABP, Amazon, Artex, Ashoka University, Blue One Inc., Bank of Baroda, British Council, Culture Ireland, Diageo, DIPR, DLF, Easy Diner, Ekank, Element 94, Etsy, Harper Collins, Hawthornton Foundation, Harvard University Press and Murthy Classical Library, Irish Embassy, iStart, Foundation, all good? Foundation John Michalski, JCB, LIC, Manipal Hospitals, National Book Trust, Paytm, Penguin, Plan India, Pocket FM, Rajasthan Tourism, Roastery, SBI, Shiksha Sankul, the Norwegian Embassy, and Reckitt Benkisa. Thank you so much.
with germ defense. इसकी क्या जरूरत है?
हाँ, मुझे क्या जरूरत? सामान तो सारा घर बैठे आ जाता है। और धूल मिट्टी तो आजकल जैसे खत्म ही हो गई है। और बच्चे तो सब कुछ स्कूल में ही सीखते हैं, है ना? और ये जो इतने बीमारी वाले जर्म्स आए हैं, उनका क्या?
अरे समझ गया।
इसीलिए मेरा भरोसा सिर्फ डेटॉल विद जर्म डिफेंस। ये रखे मुझे और मेरे परिवार को बीमारी फैलाने वाले जर्म से सुरक्षित। पूरे परिवार की सुरक्षा रोजाना. That all. We're 100% sure.
You have to understand where we come from. We are born of the desert, imposing, yet bountiful for those who seek it. We are Rajasthan, a singularly exceptional environment for a single born and rare flavor, and beyond the unrelenting need, the perfect 6-year-old body, and the rare Indian botanicals that finish our cup. It's the spirit of our people that makes us who we are. Peoples who craft with a single-minded passion and transform every precious resource into something truly exceptional, rich, bold, and with an incredible depth of flavor. This is single malt, as it should be, done in true Rajasthani spirit, nurturing and protective of our environment. That is why we are perfectly represented by Bidoun, the great Indian bustard that finds a safe haven here. We are who we create for. We are innovators, artisans,